Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 366, Judaism Disrupted. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And as you know, we are in the midst of this series exploring spirituality, and we sort of thought that this week we were taking a break from that series to introduce you to an exciting new book that has come out by a great hero of Jewish reimagination. And then we started to read the book and realized that actually it might not really be a break from the spirituality series, because the book talks a lot about a reimagined Judaism as a spiritual practice that actually works for us. So you'll have to decide for yourself whether or not this is a break from the spirituality series or is just part of the spirituality series. We are excited to welcome today our guest, Michael Strassfeld, who is famous as one of the editors of the Jewish Catalog, along with Richard Siegel of blessed memory and Sharon Strassfeld. And actually, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the initial publication of the Jewish Catalog, which at least has been talked about as perhaps the biggest selling Jewish book ever, other than the Bible. For those who don't know that much about the Jewish Catalog, it was kind of a do-it-yourself guide to Judaism inspired by the Whole Earth Catalog. We spoke about the Jewish Catalog at length with our guest, Rev. Ellen Prell, who has studied the Jewish Catalog, back in episode 84. So if you're interested in learning more about the Jewish Catalog, check out episode 84. Now, over the years on Judaism Unbound, we have been really blessed to have been able to have some conversations with some of the elder statespeople of Jewish reimagination, people who were doing this work back in the 60s and 70s, perhaps the 80s. If I start talking about people later than that as elder statespeople, I'm going to have to include myself in that. So we're going to stop at the 80s. And we get really excited when folks who are doing that work, and it was really kind of out there back then, end up getting even more out there. That's what's going on right now with Michael Strassfeld, who has written a book that has just come out a few days ago called Judaism Disrupted, a spiritual manifesto for the 21st century. Now, when we talk about Judaism Disrupted, that may be an opportunity for some folks to go back and listen to some of our earliest episodes on Judaism Unbound. Those 10 initial episodes that we put out there were full of the ideas about disruption. I think we talked about it a lot in episode 1 and episode 4. Basically, that Judaism as it has been is not going to end up being Judaism as it will be. And that's always true because Judaism is always evolving. But sometimes you have a sense that this is a period that's going to have a great leap or a great disruption. Before we get into it, just a few more words of introduction. Michael Strassfeld grew up in a modern Orthodox family in Boston. When he was an undergraduate at Brandeis University, he was the chair of an organization called Concerned Jewish Students, which organized a demonstration at the National Gathering of Jewish Federations, which was taking place in Boston in 1969. The students in that demonstration asked the National Federation system to change their priorities to emphasize Jewish identity and education. Michael Strassfeld also chaired the New England chapter of the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry in 1968 and 1969. While he was a graduate student, he joined an organization called Chavarat Shalom, led by Arthur Green, who was a guest on Judaism Unbound, episode 133, and that has come to be seen as a kind of laboratory that was going on at that time of new approaches to Judaism. And out of that experience came the Jewish Catalog, which we've talked about. It was published in 1973, and the second Jewish Catalog was published in 1975, and the third Jewish Catalog was published in 1981, and then they stopped publishing Jewish catalogs. After all the Jewish catalogs had been published, Michael Strassfeld decided to become a rabbi and ultimately received rabbinic ordination from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in 1991. He served as the rabbi at Congregation Anshe Chesed in New York, and then as the rabbi of the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, founded by Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. Michael Strassfeld was also the founding chairperson of the National Chavurah Committee and is currently the executive director of the Jewish Counterculture Oral History Project. We are so excited to have this conversation. So, Michael Strassfeld, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's a great honor to have you.
I appreciate being here.
I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. And I thought that maybe we could start by talking a little bit about what you thought, let's say, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when you started to become a congregational rabbi, and what was the evolution of your thought that has resulted in this book with its provocative name, Judaism Disrupted?
Becoming a rabbi was a change in and of itself. I graduated rabbinical school at the age of 41, not because it took me 20 years to graduate, but because I was very influenced by the Jewish counterculture, which was very much in favor of people doing Judaism themselves and had a tinge of being anti-rabbinic, particularly the way we saw Judaism being practiced in suburban synagogues where often the rabbi was supposed to do Jewish and the congregation was supposed to watch the rabbi being Jewish. And over the period of my rabbinate, it felt to me that prayer services were not working well for most people. There were some people that were happy, and those were the people that came regularly to services, the core group. But that outside that core group, even more people felt that there was no reason to participate in services, which, given the structure of synagogues, are really the central aspect of synagogue life. The majority of synagogue resources are devoted, both in terms of staff and otherwise, to services. And the truth was that the thing that synagogues did least well were services, that there were other things, including creating community for its membership, which worked for the people that came regularly. And they did other things, well as education. Well, education for children they did that. I don't know if we would say they did that well, but it was, a significant piece of what the synagogue was offering.
So as you started to recognize that, what is it that happened to your thinking? It feels like you're starting to describe a Judaism that maybe wouldn't have prayer at the center. Is that where you started to think, what would that Judaism look like? Or was the experience of seeing that prayer services weren't working for the majority of Jews, was that something that set you off to figure out why that was, and maybe that there's something more fundamental at play here?
I think at the beginning, I thought that what was necessary was to change services, to change in the ways that would make them more accessible, but even more importantly, more meaningful for people. The reason services didn't work was not just that they were in Hebrew, a language that most people were not fluent in. Wasn't just the God language, which some people couldn't really relate to. Even if they read the prayers in English, they were saying to themselves, well, why am I saying this? And I think if you asked people, what does it mean to pray? They would say, well, it means to ask God for things. And in the liberal congregations that I was involved in, very few people really believed, that God would answer. So therefore, that undercut the whole purpose of prayer. So the next step was to see if there was a way to make the prayers feel more, or for people to experience the prayers as more connected to things that were important in their lives. So if it wasn't about asking God for things, then it needed to be either an opportunity to spend some time in reflection, or to focus on inner qualities in people's lives, or to feel a sense of spirituality, to feel connected to God, to feel connected to the oneness in the world. But there was a moment, there were two moments actually, where the disconnect between services and people struck me very sharply. The first was the Friday night after 9/11. Here was a synagogue in Manhattan, obviously affected everyone in America and beyond, but particularly in New York. It was felt in ways more deeply than perhaps elsewhere in the country, just because people knew people who were killed, and we all saw the smoke and the ashes, et cetera. So I decided that Friday night that when we came to sing the hymn Lecha Dodi, a prayer that's at the heart of the Friday night service, which actually comes from the mystics and has a whole bunch of mystical meanings that most people aren't aware of because it's all coded, but it's seen as it's something that's sung. It's a climax in the service, and it talks about the city that's broken and a sense of destruction. And so I introduced the Lecha Dodi with that kavanah, with that intention to say that we know what this means. And I think for the people there, they felt this prayer that they'd sung many weeks in a row now had some direct connection, direct meaning. And I wondered whether in synagogues across America, that Friday night, whether rabbis or others were making that connection. And while I'm sure that every rabbi got up and said something or said, well, we should say a prayer for the people that were injured and solidarity with the families of those who were killed, so that it wasn't as though it went unmentioned, but that the liturgy was unchanged from the week before 9/11 to that week. That seemed to me a reflection of this deep disconnect, that if the liturgy didn't have anything to say about something as important and as traumatic as that, then there's something really wrong.
I'm really interested in that on a couple of levels, and I'm also curious the next piece of, the 20 plus years since then. But, I think what's so sad to me, but also like kind of an opportunity, I feel mixed about it. Like, I actually think that people, I don't know your synagogue in 2001, but I can speak to other synagogues. I can speak to my own and speak to others that I've been a part of. I actually think that most people, they'd be going, oh, wow, this prayer can actually like mean a thing. It's not that people, by and large, are striving on Friday nights or Saturday mornings to like find meaning in prayers and like failing. I actually think it's a step beyond that, where people don't even realize that there can be stuff in this liturgy that touches them deeply. And then when a 9/11 happened, it's just like, oh, wow, there's something about a broken city that's directly relevant. All of a sudden, it's like something gets unlocked, and oh, these are not just a soundtrack. I like soundtracks, by the way. I don't mean to demean soundtracks, but it's not just like a bunch of things that we sing to then get to schmooze with each other at Oneg afterwards. And once again, I like the schmoozing together at Oneg. All of these things are good things. And Oneg being like the eating snacks or whatever that happens in many synagogues after services. But like, I actually believe that for a lot of people, we've done this liturgy so rote for so long that they're not even trying to find the gems, except for when something really tragic, traumatic happens. When maybe not on a global scale like that, but maybe like if something tragic, traumatic happens in their life, then they might look into the liturgy for that. And so I actually believe that there's something you're pointing to where like, oh, these prayers have utility potentially. I'm also thinking to myself, like, your takeaway could have been, let's not do services. Like, or let's, like, it could have been, we're going to do something instead of services entirely. On Friday nights, we're going to do X that is not sitting in a sanctuary and praying. I think there could be room for both those answers. But basically, I'm curious what the next stage in that evolution was that got you to the place of writing this book. But I also am curious, like, what you just said points to around the continuing power of prayer that is mostly not operating because we haven't even been taught to look for it. We've become like so cynical about having any relationship to this stuff that like we don't even strive to find it in the first place.
It's really striking that the point that you're making is that people don't even think there's a possibility of connection. The assumption is this is what we say and we like it, we like to sing it, It feels familiar. It's tradition, all the reasons. And that's part of the challenge is that the people who are there, for the most part, like it. Otherwise they wouldn't come like the rest of the people. So part of the dynamic when I tried to change things is the people that were there were people like, leave it alone. We like what it is. What are you trying to do, Rabbi? And you want to do things for the people that aren't coming? Well, we don't think they're going to come even if you change it, which probably true as well. And a different experience, I went to many years ago to a conference about healing, and they had, clergy of different flavors come and talk about what they did as chaplains. And there was a Catholic nun who talked about how she gave examples of different prayers, she said, with people who were in the hospital facing surgery, recovering from surgery, had a good prognosis, had a bad prognosis, and she had different prayers. And then when the rabbi got to speak, a perfectly nice person, all he could do was talk about the Mishberach, traditional prayer that said for people who are ill, and the only thing that changes in that prayer is you put the person's name in Hebrew. So it's specific, but it basically says, please God, heal whoever it is. But that prayer said, whatever the circumstance. In other words, if someone had just been told they have 3 months to live, or someone had just been told the surgery was successful, it was the same prayer. Rabbis aren't trained to create a prayer spontaneously, which is the moment to make that connection to something that's happened in a person's life or in the world, something wonderful and something terrible. We just think there's a prayer book. And most often the conversation is, which page do we start? Which page do we end? And where do we skip some things? That's not the question. The question is, what do we want the experience for people to be? The traditional service is structured around a movement towards the Shema, the Hero Israel prayer, and the Amidah, the central prayer of every service. But I always imagine that if you took the pages of the prayer book and threw them up in the air and then gathered them up and then said them in that order, for most people in the congregation, it would make just as much sense. And as a rabbi, we're always trying to explain and say, no, but there is some rationale behind this, or you could understand this prayer, or you could understand this line in the Psalms. The problem is, if I explain this line in the Psalms, what about all the other lines in the Psalms? And if I explained it 2 weeks ago, who's going to remember? You can't explain everything all over again. So increasingly, I felt that services are too long, too routine, and the next stage was coming to do healing services.
So as you're talking, I'm thinking about a version of you are Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars, and there's some Luke Skywalker who you're training, because I'm thinking about the you from the 1970s. You felt that Judaism, as it was being practiced, wasn't working. And you, for example, joined Chavarat Shalom, which you didn't found, but it was founded by Art Green and Zalman Schachter Shalomi and others who I guess had previously felt that and had said, no, we're not going to come to our local synagogue and try to suggest some changes to the services. We're out of here. We're doing so, but we don't hate it. We love it. We actually want to do it better. So we're going to go out and do a new way of doing synagogue in a way. And you were very attracted to that, and you went there. You also led this group called the Concerned Jewish Students who came to the National Convention of the Jewish Federations and actually basically, I don't know, had a huge protest or occupied it or sort of basically demanded of them certain things. Of course, you also edited the Jewish Catalog, which was a way of saying to people, you don't like the way it's happening in these organizations. They feel dead and stultifying to you. You can do it yourself. Here's a guidebook that will sort of empower you and give you the sense of authenticity to go off and do it yourself. And I'm sort of wondering, here's my connection to Obi-Wan Kenobi and Luke Skywalker, but if there was a you from the 70s that you are now training here in the 2020s, do you imagine that people should engage in some of those same tactics and approaches that you said? In other words, do you think that the ideas that you're developing here are going to be able to be implemented by synagogues and other Jewish organizations? Or do you imagine that what ultimately the ideas that you're developing in this book, do you imagine that they could be or should be a kind of philosophy for getting people to do things outside the system? And can you start maybe by telling us a little bit about Chavarat Shalom and why it attracted you at a time when you were not as interested in mainstream synagogue life?
Chavarat Shalom, this intentional community that existed in the Boston area, was the place where I really learned to lead services. There was a basic notion that they understood, which I referred to earlier, that there is a kind of flow in the service. The idea was that the person leading the service would structure the service, would think about the ebb and flow in the service and lead it accordingly. That was a significant change. And the other change that was significant was a sense of you could have a kavanah, an intention, or really it might be better to say a theme. I remember actually Art Green led a service that was structured around the word kol, meaning all. And it's a word that appears frequently in the liturgy and that you would never ever pay attention to if you're just praying along, because it's just like one of those little words that help make up the sentences. In the first year of the Chavarah, the services were very experimental. They had a group of people creating them, and they did different things each week. And I visited in the first year. I wasn't a member. And I remember instead of the Torah reading, they read a poem by D.H. Lawrence. The structure, what's known as the Matbeya Tefillah, the underlying superstructure of the services was intact, except where it wasn't. Looking at the service structurally and its flow, and responding to that, not just like how much of it do we say and how much of it do we cut out.
The name of your book is Judaism Disrupted. And for me, disruption has been a major concept coming out of Clayton Christensen's work on the innovator's dilemma, disruptive innovation. And his insight, one of his main insights in that work, is that it's very hard to respond to disruption from within the existing landscape of organizations because, for example, the experimentation that you're talking about that took place in the first year of Chavarat Shalom, that can't happen. I mean, it can, but it rarely does happen in an existing synagogue because, like you said earlier, there are a bunch of people that are coming there who actually like it the way it is. That's why they're coming. But they're the people who, if you start experimenting all the time, they're going to give you a lot of grief. I guess my question is, if you are, again, advising the Luke Skywalker of our time or the Michael Strassfeld of the 2020s to say, what should I do about these situations? Would your advice be you should go off and start a new Chavarah? Do you think that that's the pathway where some of this stuff can get worked out for our time?
I think it's a dilemma. I see more and more rabbis deciding to go out on their own to create their own institutions. There's clearly an advantage to that because there isn't the people who say, but we've always done this. And, I'm a loyal member of the synagogue. Why are you doing this to me? It's challenging for two reasons. One is not everybody has the skills or the personality to create a new institution. And secondly, let me skip ahead. I think bottom line is the Jewish community needs all those kinds of things, partly because we don't know what's going to succeed, partly because different people want different things. The synagogue, to its credit, is multi-generational. And the synagogue sees itself as an ongoing institution, wants there to be a future. The truth is that some of the chavarot that were founded in those days are coming towards the end of their existence because their membership has aged and eventually will no longer be here and the group will end. On the other hand, the model that Chavarat Shalom created and the Jewish catalog reflected did deeply influence synagogues across the board. Music that was, I would call it folk music, that meant that people could sing rather than cantorial music, which was to listen to. Rabbis coming off the bima, sometimes literally coming off the platform where they led services or gave sermons, that more informal style. Not every synagogue, but the vast majority of synagogues were affected by those things. That's a sign of potential change, even within established institutions. It's interesting to think back to those days. I guess we also thought the suburban synagogues were not going to, we thought the Chabad model was the model, and there we proved wrong. Like suburban synagogues didn't disappear. But I feel that synagogues are in deeper trouble these days than they were back then in the 60s and 70s. We're not in good shape, and that therefore we need to look at doing things very differently, not just tinkering around the edges. And the challenge is, and the book tries to do this, is to draw on traditional text and traditional ideas so that it feels rooted in the past, not a complete break with the past. It's not like, let's just, throw away your prayer books and be free. You may end up getting rid of prayer books, but it's not the attitude. It's not, we have to destroy the past. And maybe that's a Jewish form of disruption.
I want to sit with this. First off, because the attitude piece, I'm torn. I wouldn't use the language of destroy. I'm not here to destroy. I do think that what you're describing is a set of verbs that start with D that are not destroy. So deconstruct. I think deconstruct is a verb that is less like, ugh. It's less anxiety ridden. It's a word that I want to use because when we use destroy, that's a straw man. I know basically no one who did this in the 1960s or in the 1980s or in the 2000s or the 2020s. I know basically no one who has put serious effort. I'm not going to say basically. I know no one who has put serious effort into reshaping Jewish anything, whether that's prayer services, whether that's, any element of Jewish life. I know nobody who has put hours of their time, serious, significant life moments into that, who's trying to primarily destroy things. I think that's a framework, and I'm not saying you believe that either. It's just that's a framework that people use when they are wedded to the thing that they're claiming would be destroyed. When they believe in that more than they believe in the potential of whatever the new thing is. I think usually people want to say, oh, what is actually amazing here? What are the awesome ingredients of, let's say, a Friday night service that should be retained? What is awesome about Lecha Dodi, to go to an example you said before? I think Lecha Dodi is dope. There's a prayer that it's constructed with, first off, 9 verses. It's a lot of verses, but the specifics of the verses matter less to me than the fact, A, it's an acrostic poem, really interesting. It's an arrogant acrostic poem because the author puts his own name into the beginning of each verse. But I actually think it's really cool to have liturgical ways of acrostic poetry. I think we lose sight of them when we translate them in ways that obscure the acrostic poetry. It's a love letter. It's embodied in physical. There's a point where everybody traditionally stands up and welcomes an embodied kind of Sabbath bride that is representing Shabbat, that we are physically welcoming. And that to me is a teaching that Shabbat isn't just an idea, right? It's something we do in our bodies. There's that's the kind of thing where all of a sudden, I'm not trying to destroy Lecha Dodi, but how do we distill Lecha Dodi to its essence and maybe not say 9 verses, which is super long, but instead get at some essential components? That's not a destruction. That's a deconstruction and then a reconstruction. And so I'm kind of getting at that side of piece. And I want to sit with the question of, you mentioned that many of the small communities that the Chavarot that were founded, say in the 60s and 70s, are reaching their endpoint. And my response to that is 50 years. Wow, that's good. From my perspective, that doesn't point to, oh, those weren't the answer because they aren't proving to be something that lasts for hundreds of years. So from my perspective, it's almost like, how might we shift our mindset so we're not trying to find the solution for the next many hundreds of years, but where we actually say, oh, finding solutions that work for 50 years or even for 10 years, that's not an insignificant thing. And if those then, like you said, have an impact on the more mainstream institutions, if Chavarot gets started and they futz around with prayer in certain ways that shifts what the main synagogues are doing, all the more of an argument for them, even if those Chavarot end up not lasting. So that was a lot of ranty stuff, but I'm kind of curious to hear more about like, so what if stuff isn't eternal? And so what if we do, in certain senses, quote unquote, destroy the prayer book, though we'd use the other language I talked about?
I think for me, I'm very focused, and this is my focus, and I'm not saying it should be everybody's focus, is how can Judaism help reach many Jews, not just the elite. The Chavarot are a form of elite. Not everybody in Chavarat Shalom was Art Green, with PhD in Jewish studies, et cetera, et cetera. But there was a fair number of people that had strong Jewish backgrounds. And the Chavarah was a self-chosen group of people. I'm concerned about all the other Jews as well, right? And we need all kinds of things. And you're right that if something lasts 10 years and is meaningful, that's not nothing. In 50 years, that's not nothing either. But I'm at a place where I think some of the models in the past have failed for most people. And whether that's the denominational model or whether it's the traditional prayer service, which does work for many people. But for most Jews, neither of those things have very much meaning. The question is, like, if you're using an example of L'chadodi, like, what's the context so that someone will experience that and say, wow, this is great. I talk about, in the book, I reuse the term Minhag America from Isaac Mayer Wise, which is to say that there is an emerging practice of American Jews, which is not created by halakha or emendation of halakha, of Jewish law, but it's just what Jews have come, again, I'm always talking about liberal Jews, I'm not talking about Orthodox Jews, have come to see as a way to live their Jewish lives. A small but not insignificant example is even for liberal Jews who keep kosher, they all eat in any kind of restaurant. They might be careful not to eat certain food in those restaurants, but they don't only go to kosher restaurants. There's no moral argument for eating in a restaurant. It's just we want to do it, and we want to participate in America, right? So I think we're in a place of minhag, that instead of halakha, that is custom instead of law. And I decided not to say minhagei America, the customs plural, because even though I want to encourage people to do it differently, I think we want to have a sense that we're all part of one custom, that I don't reject you or have difficulty with you or because the way you observe Shabbat is different than mine. It will be a challenge when we get together. But I'm worried that too many Jews are being left out of the conversation and, will never make their way to an independent minyan prayer service.
This conversation is reminding me, or it's taking me back in certain ways to conversations that we actually had on this podcast with two of your teachers, Yitz Greenberg and Art Green. And in both cases, we had a kind of interesting exchange that I've been mulling over now for years. In the case of Yitz Greenberg, I remember him saying, well, maybe in the next era of Judaism, there will be different brachot, different blessings. Instead of the traditional ones, there would be blessings for, I don't remember the examples that he gave, but, whatever, blessings for an electric car. He didn't say that, but I'm just saying, conceptually. And I said to him, well, but maybe in the next era of Judaism, there won't be any brachot at all. There won't be any blessings at all because we'll have a new conception of what Judaism is and it won't involve blessings. And he kind of thought for a second and he said, yeah, well, I think you're right, but it's hard for me to conceptualize that because I like blessings, basically. Mm. And Art Green, we had a very similar conversation. We were talking about prayers, and I said, well, maybe in the next version of Judaism that we're talking about, there just wouldn't be any prayers. Or I don't remember exactly the exchange that we had, but it was along those lines. And he said something like, yeah, that's true. Actually, I really like prayers. They work for me, so I'm trying to improve the prayers. And that makes a lot of sense. And so as we're having this conversation, what I'm really hearing very powerfully is an invitation towards the Jews out there who are inclined to say, this isn't working for me. I may be interested in coming to a service that I could understand better or that was more clear. But you're also saying, I think, that while you're not necessarily the one who's going to describe that next version of Judaism, as a kind of authority figure of some kind, you're inviting people to do that experimentation and not feel that that's somehow illegitimate or problematic. In fact, you're giving it a name, Minhag America. And one of the things that you did in the book that I think was really compelling is that you also give a variety of texts and other sources from the past of Judaism that either can be interpreted to authenticate wild experimentation in the present, and or things like examples like Hasidism that may be things, elements of Judaism that we think of as not in the province of liberal Jews, but actually that have a lot of content there that could be reimagined and remixed by liberal Jews, again, through the invitation that you're giving. So I'm wondering whether, first of all, if you want to respond to any of that, but also if you could give us some of the examples of some of those concepts or texts that you feel are most powerful or could be most powerful in the hands of liberal Jews who are kind of alienated from the existing set of institutions.
Yes, I think the difference between me and Yitz Greenberg and Art Green, both teachers of mine, especially Art, I'm in a more radical place. So I'm not saying like, well, maybe someone in the future will write new blessings. Like I'm fine about writing new blessings. And I'm also fine saying like, well, we don't even need this traditional structure of blessings, right? So if you say, thank you for this bread, I think that's the equivalent of bracha, or the blessing. What I try to do in the book is recapture what I think is the original meaning or purpose of a practice, then take it and try and make it accessible. To give an example, the mezuzah. This little thing you put on your doorpost, and inside it is a scroll written by a scribe. It includes the Shema, the Hero Israel prayer. And traditionally, you're supposed to put it on all your doors at home. And some people have a tradition of every time they walk by, they put up their hand and kiss it. It's a perfect example of something that disappears because it's there all the time. And either you're automatically kissing it, which some people do, and what most people do don't even remember that they have the mezuzah there. And it's interesting. So I found a source. There's a book called Sefer HaChinuch. It's a medieval work which basically goes through all 613 commandments in the order that they're found in the Torah, and gives a little, a page or two explanation. And he talks about mezuzah as a category that I wasn't particularly aware of, despite my Jewish education, of mitzvot tamidiyot, that are tamid, that they're always there. And if you think about it, you could see like the mezuzah is always there. I mean, except for the moment you hang it, then you say a blessing. But after that, you don't like take it down, during the summer or whatever. It's just there, and you forget it. So if the idea is it's supposed to be an awareness practice, you're supposed to look at the mezuzah or touch the mezuzah and say, oh, I want to remember, do the right thing, to be a good person. But you don't, because it's there and it's invisible, except when you have to move and take it down or not take it down, whatever. So I suggest that when you leave your home in the morning, take a moment, notice the mezuzah, and set your intention of you want to take with you your keys, your phone, and a spiritual thought for your day. And similarly, when you come home, wipe the dust of distress off your feet of the muck of the day, and come back into that space, which home has its own challenges, but home also has a special feeling. What would that mean for your spiritual life if you do that? These constant mitzvot, to call them that, are really interesting, if you look at it from the structure of halakha, or Jewish law, because they don't fit the pattern. In other words, if the question in halakha Jewish law is, have I fulfilled the commandment? Many commandments, there are specific instructions of like how much matzah you eat to fulfill the commandment of eating matzah. There are other commandments that don't have that structure. The most repeated commandment in the Torah, 36 times we're told to take care of the stranger because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. So you could say it is just a number, as it seems to be the most important mitzvah. There's no quantity of how you fulfill that commandment. It's not like if I'm nice to two strangers, I did it, or one stranger every other day. There's none of that quantification. But what it is asking us is to always think about the stranger. And my responsibility is to react in any moment that issue comes up with that notion.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about the stranger and also the distinction you're making between different kinds of commandments. I haven't really sat with this, the always commandments that you're talking about with the mezuzah, that you put them up once and then they're there forever. And I'm even thinking of like hanging a ketubah, a wedding, a marriage contract on your wall. That's a similar thing where, yeah, there's one mindful act where like you put it up and then it's just there. And there's a beauty to those pieces that sort of just permeate into your body theoretically. And there's also a danger because if you don't enliven your relationship to that commandment or that idea or that practice, then it can just become nothing. The reason why I want to dwell on loving the stranger, that I think you're arguing is another kind of always commandment because it doesn't say, here's the number of times per week you must do that. Like, I think that's a great point. And that actually points me back to something you said really briefly about how, there's Minhag America and people go to restaurants, even if they keep kosher, they go to any restaurant, not one that's like certified as kosher in its kitchen. And they just might make choices about what they eat on the menu. I want to argue that that's not just like a convenience. That's not a thing we just happen to do. I think that is a value-based judgment. And I'm not saying you disagree. Just I want to really take what you said there about how like, there's certain things that we just sort of do as progressive Jews, non-Orthodox Jews. I want to find under the surface the moral arguments we are making through those acts. As an aspiration, I see actively the interaction of Jews with those who aren't Jewish as something to strive for and to craft Judaism around. I actually think that any laws, and this is part of why I don't relate to halakha in a traditional way, like a lot of traditional laws are kind of designed to reduce interaction between Jews and others. And that includes food rules, it includes other things. And so if I think that loving the stranger is something that I must do, not just in my head as an intellectual act, but as something I must practice day to day in my life, that means, well, you got to live near people who aren't Jews in order to love them. And by the way, I'm also somebody who, for me, that it's not like I married my spouse who isn't Jewish because of that commandment, but I do think actually that having the chance in my nuclear family, I'm not a big nuclear family guy in all sorts of ways, but like having a person who I live with, who is quote unquote a stranger, a ger, that creates in me an ability to fulfill that commandment in ways that other people don't have. I don't want to frame it as, I just happen to do that and like it's because I don't commit to the classic halachic stuff. It's like I actually have active commitments that call me to those kinds of things. And once again, this is not to say I'm like yelling at what you said before. I think you said something quickly that we could expand on. And so what I'm getting at is what's under the surface in these practices we're already doing. You talked about mezuzah. I think for a lot of Jews, mezuzah is not at all about reminding them to be a good person or to keep God's commandments. I actually think, and I'm not saying that's good or bad, I'd like it to be more of a reminder in certain ways, but I think for a lot of people, this is a thing on our front door that shows this is a place where Jews live, to signal that to other Jews, to signal that to non-Jews. So from my perspective, if somebody's purpose is, I want to be reminded of commandments, then I want to be like, okay, let's have your mezuzah be like Alexa and it talks to you. And every day when you walk out, there's a set of quotes that it says to you that are specifically designed to make you think about your values. Like from my perspective, if that's the function of mezuzah, let's actually do everything to make mezuzah meet that function. If the function is we want to display that we're a Jewish home, and it can be both of these, they're not mutually exclusive, but if that's the function, then should mezuzah be paired in our heads with practices of putting up a big blow-up menorah on Hanukkah in your yard and other things? And I'm saying that kind of as a joke, but because it matters to signal that. And so for all of these things, I'm just like, how do we really go from what the function is underneath and then allow ourselves to experiment and run wild in a bigger way?
I want to make an important point that's in the book, which is I want to transform rituals into awareness practice. I want to say that the purpose of these rituals is to bring a kind of awareness to us. And the ones that work, let's keep on doing them. And the ones that need reinterpretation, then let's do that. And then there may be ones that, really don't work. I think the problem is that many people look at rituals and they say, I don't get it. Yeah, I think you're right that mezuzah for many people is a statement of Jewishness, which is why people wear them around their necks. That's not traditional at all. It's a way of saying, I'm Jewish. Like the secret handshake. Oh, you're Jewish? I'm, some of that. I'm trying to make the case that we live in a very different world. In the past, we've spent a lot of time standing in the boundaries, guarding what's inside and saying who can come in and who cannot, right? And Rabbinic Judaism, that's been the basic paradigm, for the last, 2,000 years. It's no longer the paradigm that works. But specifically, what the rabbis were genius at was creating a portable Judaism. They had a sense that, Jews were going to be everywhere. And you couldn't have a Judaism that was still tied to the temple. You had to be able to do it in Spain, France, and Germany, wherever you're going to go. I think now, portable, still good. In this age, everything is, portable. I think what we need is a permeable Judaism or a porous Judaism that is more open to the outside world. That's a radically different way of looking at the world, and that's a challenge. There's a danger that we could just get swallowed up in the majority culture and disappear. Or it could be that we're going to find new ways, more complicated ways at times, for people to live in this world. Look at the number of people we're intermarrying. Like, that's just the reality. Get with reality. This is a vision of what life can be. We want to live in an inclusive society. And so we have to figure out how to create a Judaism that can not just survive, but thrive, that people feel, this is really meaningful to me. I like kissing the mezuzah on my way out in the morning. I have a prayer to say, before you go into a difficult meeting.
I need that. Maybe you can send that to me.
In that sense, I feel we need to do more than just say, the next generation is going to do these things. We need to do it now. And I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to make sharp breaks about certain things. And I'm really happy to look in the tradition and find that there's this notion of constant commandments and say, you know what? Social justice is a constant commandment. It's not just I do it on Super Sunday volunteering thing or Martin Luther King Day. It's how I live my life. You have to figure out what is your custom, but you want to do it in response to a sense, I have an obligation here. Now I have to figure out what I can realistically do, what I can push myself to do more. And I wonder whether there shouldn't be other mitzvot that become in that category of constant.
One thing as we're having this conversation is that I'm, flashing back to, I think, something that I've put out there before in the show as a kind of thought experiment, wondering whether, it's 50 years before the Second Temple was destroyed. I sort of have this imagination of somebody, maybe, Hillel or somebody coming into the temple, into the priest's meeting and saying, I got this idea for a new form of Judaism. It would be much more responsive to the needs of the people living in the Galilee who aren't coming to the temple so much. Let me tell you a little bit about it. It would have prayers. What are these prayers? Oh, they're basically, the songs that the Levites sing when we're doing the sacrifices. Everybody will sing those songs and they'll do it in this place nearby their home. We'll maybe call it a synagogue. And I kind of imagine the priest kind of laughing that person out of the room, saying, this is because they'll say, well, okay, but when will we do the sacrifices? How will we do the sacrifices? And they say, oh, no, there wouldn't be any sacrifices. And they say, well, what are you talking about? I can't imagine a Judaism without the sacrifices. The sacrifices are Judaism. So your idea is stupid. And yet we know that that's what happened in part because the sacrifices became impossible. And I'm wondering how we take that story of the transition to Rabbinic Judaism into our time where, God forbid, there should be any kind of destruction that makes going to synagogue impossible. Yet at the same time, we need to invest in and encourage the kind of crazy thinking that early rabbi would have been accused of. And I'm also thinking about how you bring so many ideas from Hasidism into this conversation. And I'm just thinking in part, I think some of those early Hasidim were very radical and maybe were kind of saying, yeah, really, realistically, you don't
and
actually...
heretical. They were called heretical. They were called
Sabbatean. Well, because
Yeah.
they would say, like, oh, it's not really the key thing to go to synagogue services or to study in the Beit Midrash. Like, you can do these other things. And then very quickly, their successors became nervous about that. And Hasidism kind of became a version of Orthodox Judaism and has become more and more so, such that its radicalness has been lost. So much so that when we talk about Hasidic ideas, a lot of your average Jews can't even imagine what that would mean bringing into my life, because I know that Hasidim are ultra-Orthodox people. At the end, I'm just wondering again, kind of, are there principles that you imagine could really take center stage that really would connect with the people out there for whom synagogues aren't working, that you imagine, like when you think about a Judaism 100 years from now, you say, well, I don't know if this could happen, but if this was happening, I'd be very excited about it, even if they weren't going to synagogue anymore.
The change from biblical Judaism to rabbinic Judaism was just as radical. And though now we know that it took place over many centuries, and if I could close with one teaching of the Sfat Emet, the 19th century Hasidic master, who says, Torah is all about freedom. And the 613 are advice or counsels on how to live a life of freedom. He says explicitly it means not being caught up in material things. It sounds very contemporary in its language. And it's all about remembering that we should strive to be free, to take the most precious gift that we've been given, our lives, and live them with purpose and meaning. This is what Judaism is about. And then here's a bunch of ways, practices, whether it's about rereading the holidays, a whole new category of mitzvot, which I just discovered in research on this, which is mitzvot ben adam la'atzmo, commandments between a person and themselves. I never heard of this in all my years of Jewish education, which is really so contemporary, is that besides interpersonal, besides relationship with God or the ritual, is this notion of we need to work on our inner selves as well.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a fantastic conversation.
I really appreciate you having me on your program. It was a great opportunity. Thank you very much.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We hope specifically that it'll be the near future as we continue our spirituality series next week and in a number of more weeks. This is going to be a Mondo unit on spirituality. We've already had a bunch of episodes. We encourage you to listen to those if you haven't yet, but definitely continue on with us as we head into the next few weeks. So we are going to close out this conversation in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram feeds. All of those are at Judaism Unbound for our handles. Second, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. There you can check out our show notes for this episode. You can check out our Anya Shiva, the Digital Center for Jewish Learning and Unlearning. All sorts of good stuff on JudaismUnbound.com. And you can also, of course, always email us at either dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. We love hearing your questions, your thoughts, your ideas, your visions related to our podcast or related to just generally Judaism. However you are getting to our inbox is the right way. So those are different ways to be in touch with us. We also are super appreciative if you are down to send us a donation, either on a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift via JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.